Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this cold night for what I'm sure will be an excellent conversation. I'm Jenny Steffel-Johnson. I am the Associate Chair of our Urban and Regional Planning Department here. We are one of 5 master's programs here in the University of Colorado Denver College of Architecture and Planning. We also have a PhD program and undergrads, a total of about 800 students in our college. And we like to, leverage our downtown location to be able to host events like this, better connect with communities and the profession. And I am just so excited to see all of you here tonight. And I wanted to extend the offer that if any of you are interested in learning more about our urban and regional planning program, please feel free to talk to me. I also have the privilege of being the faculty advisor for our Planners Network chapter. Planners Network has its origins, frankly, in the radical planning movement of the 60s. It is a national progressive planning organization. Right now, it is basically a student organization only because we only have student members so far. But it is, in fact, intended to be a community professional organization. So we have several members of our Planners Network group here tonight. You guys want to, raise your hands? If folks, again, are interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to answer questions, get your contact information, and we can link you in, or please feel free to talk with any of the students. So thank you again so much for being here, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, CU, for hosting. Very much appreciated. Brian, if we could pop a slide forward, I want to quickly intro our other host tonight, YIMBY Denver. You might have heard this, we're a dedicated group of volunteers fighting for more inclusive housing policy in Denver and beyond in some cases. We're fighting for some systemic changes to increase housing stability, fix broken incentives, streamline permitting, legalize housing, and fund more affordable housing in the city here and beyond. Got a few quick details about us on the screen. As you can see with events like tonight, we are also engaging in a lot of discussion and education along the way. So I get the pleasure of starting with 40 minutes of discussion with Nolan here, before we move into about a half hour's worth of audience questions. I think also we'll have a little bit of time to socialize at the end of the event, and I think a few members of the audience have pitched us on moving to a bar once we shut down here if anyone's looking for a little extra time. Speaking of audience questions, if you could scoot forward just a second. I'm sharing details up here. And there are also some papers on the seats if you've seen around. You can use a QR code or go to this website, pigeonhole.at, and enter this passcode. This will allow you to enter questions at any time during the talk and also review other questions that have been submitted to possibly upvote them, ones you're particularly interested in. Once we get to the audience questions section, we'll pull it up on screen here and see what we want to talk about. So, with all that housekeeping out of the way, I'm now very excited to introduce Nolan Gray. For those of you who don't know, Nolan is the research director for California YIMBY and an expert in urban land use regulation. He's the author of Arbitrary Lines. Many of you I know have read that book. Gray previously worked as a planner in New York City, where he worked on the front lines of zoning. He's a widely published author with work appearing in outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg City Lab, and The Guardian. He lives in Los Angeles, California, and is originally from Lexington, Kentucky, as you might hear a little bit tonight. So, yeah, that's ready now to kick off the event. And wanted to start with sort of a high-level, sort of overarching question about the book and the work that you do. I think for your average citizen, zoning would seem to be a really stuffy, arcane, largely boring topic. Present company excluded, we chose to be here, so probably not a representative sample. But that being the case, you thought zoning was either exciting enough or important enough or both to write a whole book about it. I'm wondering, why do you think Denverites should care about zoning?
Yeah. Hello. Just making sure everyone's awake. Yeah, boring enough. First of all, thank you for having me. Is this going to go off again?
Maybe.
Do we need to move away? Do we need a social distance?
There we go.
Okay. Thanks to YIMBY Denver for having me and the college. It's great to be here. And it's great to see a room full of people voluntarily here to hear about zoning. If you're not here voluntarily, just blink rapidly, and we can get someone to help you out. No, yeah, I mean, but it is kind of a.
It's coming back. I think we're okay.
We can share the mic if it keeps doing that.
Okay, yeah.
So, yeah.
All right.
Sure.
I can turn that
Sorry,
off.
I'm used to yelling at undergrads. Okay, cool. How's that?
A little better?
All right, a little better. Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of a funny thing, right? Like, zoning on its face is an incredibly boring subject, right? Like, as I talk about in the book, even by the terms of like public policy analysis, zoning is this like, for so long it was this boring, ignored topic, right? You know, it's not one of these sexy policy areas like immigration or trade or education or I don't know, whatever else is sexy in the public policy world. But it was this unbelievably,
Losing it again?
is this gonna cut out again? Okay. I mean, it's this unbelievably important thing.
Sorry, maybe.
The anti-zoner, or the pro-zoners are
Hello. Maybe a little further away. Yeah.
a little further away.
Further away.
But it's this unbelievably important thing in terms of so many policy issues that affect our day-to-day lives, right? And so many issues that we're talking about right now: housing affordability, economic opportunity and mobility across the country, issues of racial equity, right? So I wrote the book, living in DC, in downtown DC, while the Black Lives Matter uprisings were underway. And then, of course, a lot of the environmental concerns that we have, environmental impacts of the way we plan our cities are huge. And so, you know, I think over the course of the 2010s, there was this mounting interest in, hey, what's this obscure little policy area that's like ruining my life, right? And more people are getting into zoning. But I found that a few things. One, there wasn't really a good go-to source on zoning. So like, literally I was recommending that people read like Zoning for Dummies, which is a pretty good way to like make someone lose interest in the subject. No offense if the author is here. Or, you know, like directing them to go attend zoning hearings or read their zoning ordinance. There wasn't really a good go-to text explaining what zoning was, the impacts that it had, and then what we might be able to do about it. So, you know, the book came out and folks are interested in it. I mean, at least what, like 70, 60 people in Denver are interested in it. So, yeah.
Great. No, thank you. And so whether we're a common resident who has heard little about zoning or you're folks like us in the room, I think something that we have in common is that we've all heard this concept of zoning as something that is designed to protect us from negative externalities in our cities. Trying to make sure there aren't smokestacks next to homes, making it help reduce criminal activity, etc. But what I thought was one of the really interesting contributions from your book was this notion that there's a mythology around zoning that we hold, and that there's a difference between what we understand to be the case, what most people understand to be the case, and how zoning truly came about. Wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so, you know, I think there's this like very like sanitized origin story of zoning, right? Of like, we had to keep factories out of residential subdivisions, and, you know, we had to deal with issues of industrialization, yada, yada, yada. And so we had to adopt this thing, and that's all zoning was doing. It was this good government tool used to separate incompatible uses and to coordinate growth with infrastructure. Coming into the book, I knew that there were kind of issues with that story, but researching the book, I don't think I fully appreciated until then just how kind of like unconnected from that mythology the reality of zoning was. Really, if you look at the origins of zoning, it's hard to separate it from a broader sort of project of, I think, at least doing two things. The first is segregating cities based on race implicitly, and then class fairly explicitly. And then writing into law one particular mode of living that reflects a certain value set of a certain type of people at a certain time. You know, as I talk about in the book, and so many great urban historians have talked about, right, this modern zoning framework that we get really reflects the values and prejudices of a particular type of Anglo elite in the early 20th century. And what I try to do in the book is sort of say, you know, hey, we think of these things as like ancient history, and zoning has changed so much in a certain sense. But, you know, a lot of those codes in many cases, or a lot of those assumptions, are still baked into zoning codes today in cities all across the country. This notion that a detached single-family home is the highest and best use, that it needs to be protected at all costs, that people who don't live that mode of living are in some way not fully verified members of society, and that, you know, all of our urban governance should be built around protecting that and privileging that. And so, you know, this is still very much baked into the way we do land use planning today, and you really see it at the origins of zoning. I'll give a couple of examples that I give in the book, right? So there are at least, I think it was like 6 cities adopt what we would call modern zoning in 1916. In the book, I talk about two: New York City and Berkeley, California. Most people know about the New York City origin story. There's myths around that too, right? So one myth is like the Equitable Life building was built, and it was so big and so bulky and so offensive that we had to downzone, we had to do setbacks. The irony, of course, is that the New York City Department of City Planning is now headquartered in the Equitable Life building. And I worked in there, like, 2 or 3 days out of the week. But the mythos is it was so big and so offensive that we had to adopt citywide use and density rules. But when you peel away, right, one of the key interest groups driving zoning in New York City in 1916 was the Fifth Avenue Association. And what they were concerned about was loft manufacturing creeping up, because that was back when distance really mattered. And so clothing manufacturers wanted to be close to clothing retail. And you read that with modern eyes and you think, well, naturally, like, the posh retail shopping district shouldn't be right next to an industrial district. But then you sort of peel away at that, and what are they concerned about? They're concerned about factory workers coming out and hanging out on the shopping corridor, right? And there's ethnic language in there of like, these are Southern or Eastern European factory girls who are scaring off our elite clientele. There's an ethnic component to it, right? Or in Berkeley, it's the same kind of dynamic, right? So in Berkeley, you see, well, we need, you'll see pamphlets of we need to keep industry out of residential neighborhoods, and then you actually look for the case of the type of industry.
Sorry, yeah, maybe turn it down a little. Let me see if I have an option for that. Sorry, buddy. Yeah. If only I knew how any of this
I can
worked.
yell like loud.
I think if we just keep it at a distance,
Okay.
I think it's working. Yeah.
Keep it at a distance.
I'll just tap you if it gets too close.
Okay. Yes. If it's getting too close, just everybody wave. Even in Berkeley, right? Like you see things about, oh, we need to keep industry out of residential neighborhoods, and it's like, well, what's the industry that they're worried about? And oh, it's funny. All of the examples are like Chinese laundries, right? So, and that's part of there's a big long tradition of that in California, of course, of attempts to segregate Asian Americans. And so, it's like I say, it's really baked into the DNA of zoning. This notion that certain types of people should be separated above and beyond. I think this very sanitized history of separating incompatible uses or coordinating growth with infrastructure. And as I argue in the book too, it's not even very good at those things.
Yeah, no. This is exactly what I was talking about. I was shocked myself to learn, because when we talked about separating industrial uses, I naturally thought, like most people, they were putting, polluting industries right next to homes. But when they talk about industrial, there's no smoke coming out of these, sewing homes. It's just who's in there sewing. Yeah. And I would like to think that those in the room tonight, and most Denverites, can't speak for all, would inherently value desegregation for its own merits and would want housing to be more affordable for renters and owners alike. But for those who might not be interested in others' benefits, such as affordable housing and desegregation, who might be really tied to the status quo, where their housing value is going up and up endlessly, outpacing wage growth, certainly here in the city and elsewhere, what case can we make to them for zoning reform?
Yeah, that's a really good case, right? I mean, so this is a challenge working as I do in California. Jonathan said, hey, you guys solved the housing affordability crisis in California. Can you come out here and explain to us in Colorado how you did it? So,
word for word.
Yeah. You're welcome. Totally lost my thread. How do you make the case to people who are potentially beneficiaries of the status quo? Right, so I'll give you an example. Imagine you are a boomer, gotta love them. You bought your home in 1970 for 2 magic beans in the Bay Area, and it's now worth like $5 million. Right? In a certain sense, you won the lottery. Like, you might not even work in tech, but now you're like, and also because of Prop 13, you're not even paying property taxes on it. You're paying like, 4 magic beans in property taxes. Right? So in a certain sense, like, that person is totally the beneficiary of the system. But I would argue in every single sense that matters, like, that person is a real loser, right? Their children, their young adult children, are not going to be able to live within 2 or 3 hours of where they live if they even stay in the state. When grandkids come to the picture, they're not going to get to see them. Their friends and family and colleagues and the people, their social support network is slowly cashing out and again moving away, moving to places like Colorado where we're exporting our housing crisis. You're welcome for that. And yeah, I guess, the neighborhood is still all single family homes, but the homes are gradually being demolished and they're being turned into these little McMansions where only the super wealthy are able to move in, right? Is that person like winning, right? Like, is that person in a great situation? I don't think so, and this is why, of course, the YIMBY movement, the heart and soul of it are, I think, young, millennials, and we're trying to bring the Zoomers in, TBD, who are realizing, oh, I don't have a path to homeownership, even though I'm working a good job and I'm paying my bills and paying my dues. But I think in California, we're to a point where the crisis is so bad that it's even affecting people who theoretically are supposed to be the beneficiaries of the system. And I think that's going to come to more and more places. I think another way that I message this, right, is, don't you want housing to be affordable for people like you, right? So I think many people, my whole theory of housing is that people only support housing that they can envision themselves or someone who they love living there, right? I think people have just a basically kind of selfish policy attitude toward this, and that's not, that's just human nature, right? If I can't imagine somebody I love living there, then what do I care if the housing gets built? It's only going to impose a cost on me. But when you put it in terms of their children or maybe them when they retire and they want to downsize and they're realizing, oh, there's no townhouses or apartments in my neighborhood, I have to move across town or I have to leave the state. Or if you put it in terms of people like them, right? So, I make this case with extended family, right? When a family of mine moved to Lexington, Kentucky at a time when it's very affordable, dramatic increase in opportunity, one of the only places in Kentucky that's really thriving and doing really well. I mean, there are a few other places. But they were able to make that move because there was an affordable housing stock, right? And so when you say to them, like, yeah, I know that, like, you don't like the look of the apartments or the 0.01% increase in traffic is gonna, like, ruin your commute, but, like, don't you want, oh, getting too close. Don't you want Lexington to remain a place that's affordable to people like you coming up today? And I think people can understand that when you put it in those terms.
Right. Also, a lot of good work from Enrico Moretti and others about like the national scale impact to our own wealth and economy on an individual basis. The jobs we hold. So I'll encourage you all to look that up separately and later. But I will say there's been a lot of authors over the past, particularly decade, as like you said, this has caught the national interest. I mean, some folks have been studying this for a long time, but in the last decade, a lot of people putting pen to paper on the inequities and the difficulties and the consequences, the negative consequences with zoning as it exists today. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing that's very unique about your book is that you don't just suggest we tweak zoning, you make a case for a path forward that I think I can fairly characterize in today's discourse as relatively radical, which is abolishing zoning entirely. I guess, why go so far?
Well, I had to have a provocative thesis to sell books. I go to the press and I'm like, I have a book about why we should reform zoning like 5%. And jokes aside, yeah, I wrote the book with this notion of a thesis of it's time to abolish zoning and start talking about what comes next in terms of land use planning. I'll say this, right? I mean, at California YIMBY, like, our focus is zoning reform. And I think in the near term, that's what YIMBY advocacy should be focused on. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, which we can talk about here in a minute, that can make zoning significantly less bad. But as I argue in the book, I think that the deeper structural elements that made zoning what it is today, that made it this system that makes it hard to build housing, that results in exclusionary outcomes, that results in really, really tight restrictions in some of our places with highest opportunity and high-quality public services, that forces essentially sprawl and more development to happen out on the periphery. I don't think the underlying structural forces that made zoning the system it is today have gone away or are going to go away. And I think if you seriously contend with that reality, then you have to think, well, what are the really radical things that we need to do in terms of the way we plan land use to maybe deal with the real land use planning issues of, separating incompatible uses or coordinating growth with infrastructure, but without building the system that can be so easily captured by folks who have exclusionary preferences or segregationist preferences, as the system we have today is. I talked to so many planners, and my understanding there's a lot of planners here who, their day-to-day job is working with zoning, but if you can get them out over a couple beers, they'll say, like, yeah, I know the whole zoning code is ridiculous. Like, it's not achieving, it has nothing to do with our comp plan. It's forcing development to just be worse and not reflect all these, new priorities that we have in planning. And I think actually when you talk to them, like, I think there's actually much more of an interest. And yeah, like, we're kind of tethered to this system that was built 100 years ago and maybe last tinkered with in a really major way 50 years ago. My understanding is Denver has done a lot of zoning reform much more recently, but your typical city, right? The zoning code is like 50 years old. It might be even older. In New York City, we were working with a zoning code that was written in 1961. I would contend that New York City has slightly changed between 2022 and 1961, and yet we're still sort of beholden to this zoning framework that bakes into law a lot of the economic and cultural sort of preferences of the day. So, you know, this is, I think, the big picture argument of the book is land use planning is really important. Zoning hasn't gotten what we want, and it's had a lot of spillover effects, but we can do better. Like, that's the project that I think planners should be working on now. It's like, what comes next?
And I'll add my own little diatribe. I would contend as well that although we've been taking a lot of activity here in Denver, I don't know, like you said, that it's always been for the positive. Many of you might be familiar with the fact that based on our 2002 blueprint, we rezoned the city in 2010, the idea being that we're finally going to move away from use-based zoning and move to form-based zoning. Unfortunately, as you mentioned in your book, we decided to do both, which is kind of the worst of both worlds. We're now saying, how can it be used? How many people can live here? And what does the building look like? But I guess thinking about this future, in this future where we've abolished zoning, so let's say your book's not selling anymore because nobody cares. So we already fixed this problem. Could you paint us a picture of what the great unzoned city, as you say in the book, looks like? I know in the book you use Houston as a part example, not a complete example. I'm wondering whether it is Houston or if there are more examples here or abroad that you point to as, you know, here's what I'm imagining in that future.
Yeah, you know, I won't tell the whole story here because I need everybody to go out and spend $30 on the book. It's available on Amazon, local bookstores. So I talk about Houston, and I said I think principles for what post-zoning land use planning should look like. I'll start with Houston. Houston's really fascinating. It's the largest major American city that never adopted zoning. They didn't adopt zoning because it's basically one of the only major American cities that actually had a vote on zoning. 3 referenda failed every single time. Most other cities, it was adopted administratively. You know, a CPC wrote it, and the council adopted it, and there wasn't this, you know, to varying degrees, there was not a whole bunch of discourse. Houston, they actually have a vote, died on the shores of working in lower middle class Houston neighborhoods. It's a fascinating case study for like what happens when you don't have zoning. I sort of hedge a little bit, like Houston still has a lot of zoning-like rules, so like minimum parking requirements. They have minimum lot sizes, even though they did drop those down in 1998. But I think it reveals the opportunities and limits of non-zoning. So I mean, the opportunities are pretty clear, right? It's fairly easy to build. There is not a citywide systematic framework for segregating land uses or regulating densities. There are still rules to deal with things like nuisances. There are still rules to deal with where certain nuisance uses can locate, right? So oil drilling or adult businesses, right? There's still rules on some of the more extreme examples, but there's not these rules that say like, well, you can't have a bakery here or a bakery there, like a corner grocery store here or a corner grocery there. You know, this lot is only going to be 4plexes and this lot can only be single-family homes. That's the framework in basically every other city. Houston doesn't have that. Also reveals, I think, some of the limits, right? So part of what made this work in Houston is that folks with the most extreme preference for strict land use regulations essentially opted into them through things like deed restrictions, basically HOA rules that have a lot of rules that look like zoning, but they're not necessarily imposed by the city government. You know, and I think a lot of people try to say, well, that's just like zoning, that's just, you know, Houston just essentially backed their way into zoning. But it's meaningfully different, first in that it doesn't cover the entire city. Like most of the city has nothing approaching zoning covering it. But then two, people actually have to opt into these things. There's still issues with HOA governance. I mean, you know, like, does anyone here in an HOA? Do you like your HOA? Keep your hands up. Okay. Right, hey, this guy likes his HOA. Are you from the HOA, like, trade group? No, like, I mean, people do opt into these things because some people have different preferences in terms of what kind of uses and what kind of densities they want around them. And the question is, like, what's the better way to satisfy those preferences? Are we going to have local governments systematically assign use and density rules to every single parcel? Or are we going to let people voluntarily, at least in some sense, opt into these things? And we can deal with the problems of governance there. To my mind, it's not an accident that Houston's the most affordable and diverse major city in America. And that it has had this unbelievable explosive growth of people often coming from places that identify as far more progressive, but have zoning codes that make it impossible to build housing, that effectively prices out low-income folks, and of course that has racial implications. So, you know, of course, the limit side of this is also really important, right? Houston made basically every other planning mistake that could have been made in the 20th century, to put it mildly, right? Building the freeways, building the stroads. You know, there's still, TxDOT is still trying to force them to widen a freeway, and you read about it and you're like, how is this happening in 2022? Right? Maybe a little bit callous about wetlands development and stormwater management. But to the extent that they don't have this system of rules saying for every single parcel in the city that permitted use and density, I think that they're only in a stronger position. And it's funny because we have these conversations about, oh, how do we get rid of single-family zoning, right? And Minneapolis gets a lot of praise, and rightly so. But then you have a city here that just never did that, right? And doesn't necessarily have that problem in the first place. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. In terms of the sort of broader framework for how I think we should approach land use planning, I mean, this is partly an invitation. I'm trying to shock people out of their stupor, right? We don't need to keep tinkering with zoning. We can in the near term to get the results and prevent the immediate housing crisis and make some progress on equity and sustainability in the near term. That's perfectly fine. But in the longer term, let's think bigger, right? What do we want land use planning to do? I set out a few ideas. I mean, first, I think planners have a really important role to play as stewards of the public realm. I think so much of what planning has become now is we micromanage the number of parking spaces and strip malls, or we spend all day, filing variance requests for a duplex in a single-family neighborhood, right? That's not why people go into planning. That's not the value out of planning. The value out of planning is actually sitting down and coming up with a plan, right? I mean, I've seen so many suburban, I'm kind of ranting now, so forgive me. I see so many suburban jurisdictions, and they'll have a zoning code that this is the front side rear setback, this is lot coverage, this is parking spaces, this is the height, the roof pitch, and then they don't have a streets plan. They don't even have a plan to incrementally build out their streets and sewer, right? And you're what is planning doing here, right? Stewards of the public realm, I think, is really important, and that role has fallen to the wayside. Regulating the things that people actually care about. I think partly why we got zoning was we were trying to deal with maybe impacts like noise or traffic generation that maybe in previous ages we couldn't really regulate in a direct way or very effectively. But that's actually what I think people care about. I think that's what people care about when they say, I don't want this commercial development happening near me, is they're worried about very specific impacts. I don't think anybody's necessarily worried about the corner grocery, but they're worried about maybe the corner grocery leaving and then some other commercial use coming in and making a lot of noise, right? It's possible to actually regulate the specific impacts that people care about. And I think that's much more of a productive project for us to be working on, thinking about.
Right, and I think as you talked about in your book, that's kind of how the regulation worked pre-zoning. I mean, it was truly just nuisance planning and making sure there was all disagreements around noise, air, sound, just immediate next door neighbor impacts without assuming how things would be on the other side. So stepping back to the concept of fully abolishing zoning, you've talked a lot about the unfortunate consequences of zoning and the unfortunate history of how it came to be in America, which is primarily racial interests and to some extent class interests. But zoning isn't unique to the USA. We see a lot of other countries with the artifact too. We have Japan with hierarchical zoning. We have New Zealand using zoning to protect its farmland. We have Germany with a zoning system that is remarkably similar to ours, albeit with fewer zones, fewer single lot restrictions, but still the R1 concept, the commercial concept, the industrial concept. Do these other countries and these other places have a similar history of how zoning came to be, racial intent, class intent, etc.? And if not, should we not just look to those places for an example of how to do zoning instead of leaning on our own history?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so this is another cool research project for folks in planning school, right? Comparative land use planning. We're kind of all in silos here on how other people do it. But yeah, so most developed countries have something that kind of sort of looks like zoning. I would say in almost every sort of facet that really matters, most of the other systems are dramatically different from ours, with the possible exception of South Africa, which I'll leave the audience to imagine why we might have a similar zoning system in South Africa, or other systems in the Anglosphere that have similar sets of issues, right? But in the book, I do talk about Japanese zoning, right? There are models abroad for I think doing zoning in a way that isn't nearly as destructive. Japanese zoning is different in a few really interesting ways, both procedurally and substantively. So in Japan, the national government actually sets the number, the zoning districts and the rules that apply to those districts, and then local governments actually get to map them. This is very different from the US, where every single local jurisdiction gets to write their zoning code completely de novo. Now, of course, a lot of jurisdictions basically just copy and paste their neighbors with minor amendments, but broadly speaking, right, zoning varies pretty dramatically from city to city in a way that's not really true of a lot of other sort of building-related regulations. So, of course, building code can have minor variations, but Denver is not writing its own building code completely from scratch, right? So in substance, it's very different, right? The national government is sort of putting up, I think, really strict guardrails on how local governments can administer this power. This is similar to what we're doing, we'll talk about this in a minute, I guess, but this is similar to what we're doing in California. It's trying to put up guardrails around how local governments can administer this power. The second is substantively different. Japanese zoning, even the most restrictive zoning district in Japan, allows for low-rise multifamily, neighborhood-serving commercial, all of this other good stuff. So yeah, as I argue in the book, right, to the extent that we can make U.S. zoning more like Japanese zoning, that's positive. I don't necessarily think, or we will or should have the federal government writing zoning districts, but you could have states saying, hey, here in the state of Colorado, here are the 10 zoning districts that local governments can map. They reflect the broad range of context. Local governments, you still get to map them, pursuant maybe to comp plan or infrastructure investments that you're making, but we're not going to let you completely write your zoning code, from scratch. That would be positive. Or if we could get U.S. zoning to a place where, even your most restrictive R1 zoning districts still allow low-rise multifamily and neighborhood-serving commercial, right? That would be great. But for reasons that I articulate in the book, I'm a little skeptical that we're going to have a path that way, and I think we should be thinking more about, moving beyond zoning altogether.
Right, that's a really great segue because I wanted to talk a little bit now about the here to there. You just talked about incrementalism as a viable approach to reach this future. And I think it's really nice to imagine this ideal future state where the city is unzoned and we have nice neighborhood corner stores that you can walk to and mixed incomes throughout every neighborhood. But I'm not sure if you've heard, Denver's experienced a lot of change in the last 10 years. And in the course of that change, there's been a lot of difficulty along the way, a lot of, frankly, involuntary displacement. So what we find as a result of that is that many residents who have experienced these harms of involuntary displacement over the last 10 years are very worried about the concept of loosening any zoning restrictions, particularly on the worry that if we loosen zoning across the city, the first target for development is going to be the lowest land values. And the lowest land values are going to be in those neighborhoods where we have lower incomes, higher renter populations, et cetera. We're going to kick people to the curb in the path to this ideal state future place. And some even actually are advocating to make zoning even stricter to make sure that, or in the hopes that that will protect certain neighborhoods. So I'd love to hear your thinking on, there's a lot of tension we feel between people who see this ideal future state and want to get there, and people who have experienced real harms in the last decade alone, let alone the many decades before. And I'm wondering, how do you see a just transition playing out in this space?
Yeah, I think one of the harms of zoning is that it doesn't necessarily direct growth to the place where we have the best public services or the most infrastructure capacity. In the U.S. context, it basically directs growth to the places where people are politically weakest, where people can't push back, where they can't sort of condition that growth on certain developments. And essentially what we get in many U.S. cities is it's impossible to build housing in the places that are best suited to housing, maybe places that don't have environmental risks, places that are actually side streets, right? Within zoning, right, it's still standard best practice, put all the multifamily on the noisy, stinky corridor, and then leave the side streets to single family housing. If you look at historical growth patterns, even right up until right before the adoption of zoning, it was the total opposite, right? People don't want to live on the noisy, smelly corridor. They want to live on that quiet side street and be within walking distance of the noisy, smelly corridor where they can do their grocery shopping, right? So I think there's an empirical element to this question of what happens when you remove a lot of these rules for the city as a whole. I think what we end up doing, as I said in zoning, is we incrementally remove these rules either in places where nobody lives, so industrial areas or commercial areas that probably frankly aren't best suited to residential development by any reasonable land use planning metric, or we put the new housing in places where there might be residential but they're politically weak or they're marginalized populations who on some level the political consensus is we don't want around here. What happens when you remove those rules for the city as a whole, though, is very different, right? So we have cases of cities undertaking citywide reform, and the patterns of growth that result from that are actually quite a bit different. So, return to Houston. As I said, Houston doesn't have zoning, but they have a lot of zoning rules. One of those rules was minimum lot sizes. So the old rule said essentially, if you want to have a detached single-family home, you have to have at least 5,000 square feet of land. They were dealing with housing cost pressure, particularly within the I-610 loop, which broadly covers urban Houston, and they were getting all these variance requests and for developers who wanted to build townhouses on 1,400 square foot lots. So we did a big study on that, what happened when they removed those rules, looking at how many units were produced, et cetera. About 25,000 townhouses had been built as of 2016, but the geography was fascinating because most of it was actually going in upper middle income neighborhoods, middle and upper middle income neighborhoods. So what was going on there? Well, the upper income neighborhoods had deed restrictions, or they had some other legal mechanism to stop the development. And then the lower income neighborhoods, the land values just weren't high enough to justify the additional density. There just wasn't enough market demand. But there actually was a huge amount of market demand in some of these middle and upper middle income neighborhoods that previously had, been reliant on these zoning rules to block new housing production. But with those zoning rules changed citywide, all the growth gets developed. A lot of the growth gets heavily concentrated into some of those areas that have really high quality public services, or probably the types of areas where you want residential to happen. So even short of zoning abolition, I think this is an important consideration when we think about how we approach zoning reform. Is like, take the wins when you can get them, right? And incremental upzonings are probably good as long as, in places like industrial or commercial areas, right? But like, where we really want to be is we want to be to a place where we're doing citywide changes, where we're moving the rules at a citywide level, which at the end of the day will actually free up a little bit more development in those places where actually demand is highest. And those are not the places where you have significant displacement risk.
So this might be a very brief question because you already touched on some of this, but I wanted to make sure, given the room we're in, that we touched on it. You've talked here a little bit, but a lot in your book about the immense amount of time that comes with the minutia of current zoning and zoning administration, zoning adjudication, not just from city staff, but also our counselors, leaders, et cetera. Currently in Denver, we're largely approving ADUs one by one, parcel by parcel, which is an absurd use of staff time, in my opinion, sorry. I'm wondering, you have a room full of planners or soon-to-be planners in this room. What do you view as this purpose and intent, and what do planners do in this post-zoning society?
As a trained and licensed city planner, right, I tend to think we have a role on the other side. And I went to Rutgers, that's Colorado's rival school, right? I think actually, as I was sort of saying earlier in my response of like, what does land use planning look like after zoning? I think there's a superficial read of this book, which is it's just a critique of zoning. But I think there was a deeper project that I'm sort of pushing in this is we have an incredible planning civil service in the U.S. We have a lot of really smart, passionate people who actually really are committed to their cities and want to do good work. Building more affordable, equitable, sustainable communities. And as I argue in the book, a lot of that talent gets wasted on this zoning system. Now the argument is not just get rid of zoning and do nothing. The argument is get rid of zoning and actually do land use planning in a way that improves people's lives but can't be captured by some of these special interests. Right? So, for example, to my mind, a much more functional component of this typical land use planning framework is the comprehensive plan. Right? So compare, let's say, public process with the comprehensive plan versus public process with a rezoning. Public process with a rezoning is you get a letter in the mail. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a public hearing at Tuesday at 10 a.m. You get to take turns yelling at the CPC. No, there will not be childcare. No, we will not read any written submitted comments. Right? The research is totally clear. That's like a really, really exclusionary way to do public process. Like certain types of people can't do that. So that, of course, gets you planning outcomes that don't represent the actual preferences of the broader community. Compare that to a comprehensive plan where you're actually sitting down and saying, like, what's our vision? Like, rather than like an ad hoc project by project review process, you're actually sitting down and saying, what's our big picture vision for the community? And you can actually do real public process. You can do survey work. You can do focus groups. You can do design charrettes. You can do, all the stuff that you want to do. You can provide childcare at these hearings. You can make sure that you get a representative sample of the community. You can maybe, have a public hearing after 6 p.m., right? That's really important work, is sitting down and doing that work and establishing a shared vision that's going to guide infrastructure investment, that's going to guide some of the land use planning work that does need to be done. That's dramatically different from zoning. It doesn't involve planners any less. In fact, I think it actually better leverages the skill set and the desires and ambitions of what planners think they should be doing and where planners know they can actually add value.
Yeah, what we set out to accomplish. Yeah. And it reminds me, I know I was digging on Germany for having zoning earlier, but it is interesting when I read a German plan, it's, our plans in America are more like 90% what can an individual do on their lot and 10% what might the city do on the side. And it's flipped in Germany. It's often like 90% what is the city going to do with parks, thoroughfares, et cetera. And then, what space is left over, you can do what you will. So we're a little short on time, so I'm going to cut one thing I did want to talk to you about, but skipping ahead a little bit. California, as many of you may know in this room, has over the last few years passed a bevy of laws that have reduced parking requirements, created some limits on zoning, in many cases, created more pressure on localities to really take an honest crack at producing more housing. I'm wondering as we're facing our own new housing crisis, our mortgages aren't in the 5 millions yet, but we're getting there. What can Colorado learn from what you've done there, both in terms of how it was accomplished and what we can do better than what you've done there?
Yeah, sure. Interesting question. So, my typical joke here used to be like the best, the housing crisis is like smoking, like the best time to stop is to not start. But like now the crisis has gone national, so here we are.
Yeah.
Right, so I think in California what essentially happened was the crisis got so bad that nobody could really deny that we needed to be building additional housing if we were going to keep the state even remotely affordable, accessible, sustainable, pick your comp plan buzzword. And there was a recognition of like the way we do land use planning in the US of local governments can set whatever use and density rules they want within their municipal limits. Everything, if they want, everything can be discretionary. They don't even have to do zoning as it was originally intended to work. Everything can be discretionary. Everything can involve this public process. We got to a point where it was like, like we're in the ditch and like our families abandoned us and we're like, okay, like we gotta like change this, right? We have to do something differently. So over the last 5 years, excuse me, there's been a lot of statewide reform. And people, even before this sort of wave happened, people were always like, oh, and I'm sure you hear this in Colorado, oh, California is too big, it's too diverse, the planning contexts are too varied, we can't do, we need a maximum amount of local control. But here's the thing, right, there's kind of only one way to like write an ADU ordinance that like basically works. And there's like details on the margins that you can tinker with, but like there's a good ADU ordinance and like we can adopt that at the state level and like put it into effect everywhere. And we did that in 2016, and what do you know, it worked. 60,000 ADUs have been permitted over the last 5 years. They're generally going in more affluent areas, and that's a whole new source of, in many cases, affordable housing that was built without any public subsidy. So to my mind, that's like a really incredible model. We've been doing subsequent reforms based on that. So SB 9 said statewide we're going to allow duplexes and lot splits as low as 1,200 square feet statewide. So saying like we're going to allow duplexes and small lot single-family homes statewide. That was passed in 2021. A whole bunch of other just small reforms to planning frameworks that have been adopted decades ago but didn't have any teeth. So you probably, is anyone, everyone here is like terminally on Twitter? Yeah, okay, so right, you've probably been hearing about the builder's remedy stuff where like Santa Monica didn't file some paperwork on time and now there's going to be a 15-story building. It's a beautiful thing. This was basically sort of dusting off this whole housing fair share mechanism that California had adopted decades ago and say like, what if we actually like gave this thing some teeth? And like, what if we actually said like, no, like we're not just going to expect you to produce a nice planning document that says we're going to plan for this amount of housing, but we're actually going to hold you to it. If you're not on track to permit your fair share of housing, then developers can sue for permits as long as they have a certain share of the property being income restricted. It's been a huge success. It's actually getting units built. A whole bunch of other procedural protections, shot clocks, a lot of little small things, right? A couple things in the last year that I'm proud of, we worked on pretty closely is AB 2011 allows, I know I was just riffing on, we only allow residential and commercial, but you know what? You gotta take your political wins where you can get them. AB 2011 allows low to mid-rise multifamily on commercial corridors, so this was appealing to people because many communities were saying, hey, we have these strip malls or we have these office parks that like nobody with any choice is ever gonna return to, and we need to come up with a plan for them, right? So AB 2011 allows mixed income, prevailing wage, residential construction on those properties. AB 2897, which is also great. Does anyone, any shoepistas? Shoepistas? It's okay. You're among friends. Yeah, so I work under Donald Shoup, who's like the guru of parking policy, which is funny because like you tell that to a normal person and they're like, oh, that's nice, and they have to go to the bathroom. But so he's spent his whole career making the case against minimum parking requirements, which essentially force the construction of off-street parking. With AB 2097, we've eliminated those minimum parking requirements within a half mile of transit. So, it's going to take time for the market to respond and start building housing that, previously was illegal to build, more walkable communities, more mixed income communities. But I think we've created a framework where it's, more positive developments are gonna unfold. Of course, we're having big picture conversations about, hey, what are the deeper structural things that we need to change in California to make sure that we don't just backslide into a lot of these rules being, neutered or rolled back or eliminated. But that's a good place to be, right? And so, yeah, here in a place like Colorado, I would say, right, like this is the time to be having these big picture statewide conversations. We can have fights over exclusionary zoning in every single jurisdiction, and maybe you'll score a few wins in, a place like Denver, right? But if you really want statewide reform, if you really want reform in those places that are the most exclusionary, right? Another example here, San Francisco, right? Everybody beats up on San Francisco, and as an Angelino, I appreciate that and respect that. But at the same time, right, like part of San Francisco's housing crisis is that all along the peninsula, like far wealthier, far more exclusionary suburbs are building basically no housing at all, right? And like that's a huge contributing factor to the housing affordability crisis in the Bay Area. A pure advocacy approach of local by local reform is only going to get you so far, and you need statewide frameworks to allow certain forms of housing as of right, to take commonly abused tools out of the toolbox, things like minimum parking requirements, and to basically just have additional protections and to iron out the process.
Thanks for the advice. Taking notes out here. So, yeah. But thank you for this. It's really been an enlightening conversation. We're now going to move on to the audience questions portion of the event. So, Ryan, if you could pull up the next slide. Is it? No, not the next slide. Sorry. If you scoot over to that. Yeah, there we go. So, got a panel of questions up here. Figured we can go in vote order. Hopefully you all chose well. Can still continue submitting and also voting on questions as we go. And I'll hand it right back over to you.
So I should just go through these?
Yeah, let's start at the top.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's nice. This is cool. I like this format. Like there are no more comments than questions. So let's start with the first one. What are the best low-hanging fruit at the state level? Not to sound like, a broken record, but I think ADUs are super low-hanging fruit. Everybody loves ADUs, right? Call them what you have to. Granny flats, mother-in-law units, casitas. People see a picture of an ADU and they're not scared of it. Homeowners recognize that it's actually an opportunity for them to make a little bit of extra money. We know from data from the first 5 years of ADU legalization in California, a lot of these units, a pretty large share of them are being rented out at affordable rates. A large share of them are rented out for $0 to parents, aging parents, or adult young children, people who, in many cases, might not be able to afford to live near folks who could, or in the community that they're from. ADUs, I would do that. Do you know of any cities that have peeled back historic district protections to allow more change within them? That's a really great question. I've heard you all have issues with historic preservation in Denver, right? I think I've heard about Tom's Diner, right? I don't want to peel any scabs or anything. Yeah, so this is what we're thinking about at California YIMBY as sort of the next horizon of issues. So I don't think it really came out in the Q&A, but one of the arguments that I make in the book is that I think zoning reform or abolition is a necessary but not sufficient condition to build the types of cities that we want. And I make that case because I think, of course, there are other mechanisms that people maybe with exclusionary preferences can fall back on, right? So I think what we've seen in California after SB 9, which was, I was talking about, that's the duplex and small lot bill, we had an exemption in there that said this doesn't apply in areas that are historic districts. And what do you know, every exclusionary suburb in California is suddenly discovering that they're historic, even though they were built in 1954, right?
Unfortunately, there was some movement over here. Looks like some new ones are at the top.
Oh, the competition is
Top
live.
two.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll be
Put
brief.
the URL up again for people who came in late.
Oh, yeah. All right, and there's also some papers around here. While you're answering that, let's flash that other slide back up to see how people can access it.
So all of this is to say this is an emerging issue. I think we need to start thinking about reform. I've talked about a few reforms. We're trying to think about this at California YIMBY. I think the bare minimum, having rules for, hey, no more than X percentage of jurisdiction can be designated as historic. If you're going to do historic districts, I think it should probably be subject to an actual vote among the people who live in that district. I mean, this is a funny dynamic, is you regularly see historic districts that get imposed on neighborhoods because a small number of people push for it. And then the mailers go out and people are like, what is this? I don't want to have to apply to change my siding, right? Or I don't want to have it be illegal to build a home with vinyl siding. So that's an emerging issue.
Top left, it's new again.
Okay. Yeah. ADUs are being, let's try to do as many of these as possible. ADUs are being blanket zoned across several Denver neighborhoods. Only a handful are being built. What can we do to promote this option? Statewide reform. Legalize them at the state level. Don't let local governments misbehave. A lot of zoning conversations are about urban areas. What is a top consideration that suburbs need to consider with zoning? Yeah, so I think, right, we've built a lot of jurisdictions where there's like no commercial. So we built in suburban context, post-war suburban context, we built communities where they're completely auto-oriented. You can't do anything. In many cases, you have to commute outside the jurisdiction for all of life's daily necessities. I think allowing more mixed uses, whether that means mixed use zoning or embracing my argument and abolishing zoning. I think in suburbs, like the play really is a lot of these missing middle reforms, allowing duplexes or low-rise multifamily that doesn't really in any meaningful way change the built character of the neighborhood, but does allow for more affordable units to get built. That's another type of reform that I find that like the person who shows up at every Tuesday 10 a.m. meeting is going to have a meltdown, but the average person is like, yeah, I wouldn't care if a duplex was built near me. And another important way to message that I found is find the neighborhood that already reflects that, right? So most, maybe inner suburbs particularly, will have areas that are a mixture of duplexes and small lot multifamily or low-rise multifamily, and maybe even they have, God forbid, a corner grocery. And not only is that not like, a bombed out neighborhood, but in many cases it's one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. So when you show people what this looks like in practice and don't let them imagine like Pruitt-Igoe or Kowloon walled city, they say like, okay, I'm happy with that.
I think this bottom right here is next up.
Governor Paulus has said housing is a top focus next year. He specifically mentioned SB 9 and 10. What policies have worked well in California?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hit that one bit, yeah.
Yeah, if you're watching this, Governor, call me, and we'll send you all our best bills. In a post-zoning world, where is hazard information, for example, flood, fire, taken into account for where to build what? Yeah, so I talk a little bit about this in the book. This is one of those things where it's like an argument against zoning and not against planning. I think it's still perfectly appropriate to say, hey, there's certain areas where there's actually an environmental hazard. And either we're not going to allow you to build here, or if we allow you to build, we're going to only allow it subject to certain provisions that actually make sure that people are not at risk or that they're not engaging in behavior that puts others at risk. That's totally appropriate. Talking about the case of Houston, right, like they have a pretty, especially after Hurricane Harvey, they have a pretty robust wetlands and stormwater ordinance, right, to deal with the specific forms of development that actually put people in danger or at risk. It's very different from saying, well, we're going to not allow barbershops here, but there. Okay.
I think top right. Yeah.
How do we help the broader public realize diversity of use type, size, et cetera? It doesn't destroy the character of the neighborhood. I'll just re-up what I just said of find the neighborhood like that already exists, that person's familiar with, and that they probably actually really like. And in many cases, you can find an inner suburb that reflects this character that like actually is one of the more expensive neighborhoods in the city. This is true, for example, like in Lexington, right? Like, there's a neighborhood where I lived right before I left. It's a mixture of, yes, detached single-family homes, but also duplexes and small apartment buildings, and law offices and other sorts of, a little corner grocery where, back when I lived there, there was a guy who every single day he would get like a 24-pack of Natty Light and walk home with it. I don't think you should do that, but if that guy's going to do that, I would prefer he walk to the corner grocery. But so show people what that looks like, right? Like, don't talk in terms of like FAR or setbacks or height limits. Like, you'll freak them out, and they'll imagine like Midtown Manhattan. Just talk to them in terms of like a neighborhood that they don't understand. Yeah, mountain towns. Yeah, so this one's tough. I mean, I think in most contexts, right, like allowing a lot more housing and then having prudent programs to try to get some of those units to be income restricted for the folks who are never going to be served by the market. I think that formula will generally work in most contexts, but in certain, like a mountain resort town, you're just going to need to build workforce housing. You're going to need to build housing for people who, no matter how much housing you built, it would probably be bid up to where they couldn't afford to live there. That's an interesting and weird exception, We have contexts like that in California. I mean, this is another thing where, right, like in California, going back to the affordable housing discussion, I think what we often end up doing with zoning is we say like, well, like, we're going to get affordable housing by saying to the developer, if you don't want to build parking, we're going to demand that you build so many income restricted units. I would argue that's like negotiating by like pointing a gun at your own head, right? Like, if you don't do this thing we want, we're going to make you do this other thing that we don't want you to do. Put your money where your mouth is. Like, build the units, buy the land, put existing affordable housing in trusts to keep it affordable. You know, provide the property tax relief needed to make these units pencil. You know, it's not sexy, but that's how you do it. Americans like Disneyland. Yeah, I mean, so I always like, I've noticed this, like everyone's planning origin story is like, I grew up in a boring suburb of Atlanta and then I went to Amsterdam and now I'm mad. It's okay, I know you're here. Yeah, I don't know, buy more people free flights to like Paris, I don't know. I find that most people do make the connection, but you know, some don't. Can you discuss your coalition building to pass state legislation? Many communities of color worry about gentrification. How do you educate, account for this? Yeah, so the coalition is broad and shifting for every single bill. For example, like, you know, with SB 9, we had a great coalition with the realtors who wanted to actually build more owner occupancy housing. Like they were saying, like the more owner occupancy units that come online, that's like more work for our folks. We had a great relationship with the Hispanic Realtors Association, who said, hey, the people who we serve don't have a path to homeownership in California as it exists today. The existing housing stock is just too expensive. How do we get more of, you know, starter homes? And a starter home in 2022 looks like a townhouse. It looks like a small lot home. It looks like a condo in a duplex or a fourplex. You know, for AB 2011, we had a great relationship with the carpenters, right? We added a prevailing wage provision, and that was going to pay rates that reflected the wages that they felt were appropriate, and we worked together and we got bills passed. I think it's the alliances shift, and you can find common cause in this. So it's going to vary based on what exactly you're trying to do. With parking requirements, right? We worked very closely with environmentalists who were like, yeah, it's kind of crazy that we like don't allow housing to be built near transit, but we make it very, very easy to build housing out on the periphery where it's completely car oriented. Landmines. What are the landmines that California has run into with their reforms, and how can they be avoided? Yeah, you know, I think it's, of course, hindsight's 2020, but like, I think it's generally pretty prudent to like not be pushing for like, not be prioritizing new housing development in places where there is any risk of displacement or where there are groups that have been historically marginalized by the planning processes. Focus your project by project housing advocacy in high opportunity areas where there's just no risk of displacement.
Just discovered this.
One of the criticisms of Houston is that is Houston sprawling? I didn't notice that. It's just the result of the lack of zoning or rules. Yeah, so I mean, to a large extent, Houston is sprawling for the same reason that like Dallas or Atlanta or Phoenix is sprawling. I mean, it emerged in the context of fairly low land values in a time when the car was the prevailing mode of transportation, and then we built all of our infrastructure around that one mode of transportation, right? So, you know, I would say to the extent that Houston doesn't have zoning, it can only mitigate that impulse to sprawl. It's easier to do infill development in this place than in any other of its Sunbelt peers, right? I mean, so there are reasons beyond zoning why Houston doesn't look like, you know, Boston, right? And it's kind of back to kind of standard urban econ. What about trailer homes? Yeah, so I mean, this is another sort of, I think, exclusionary component of zoning is in many cases there's pretty strict prohibitions on manufactured housing. In many cases, manufactured housing is only allowed in or near industrial zones, which is like the absolute worst place to build housing, and we're saying we're going to allow for the cheapest, most abundant form of housing to only be in these places where, you know, people absolutely should not be living. I don't think there should be any, other than building code, health and safety, right, which is already, in the case of manufactured housing, handled by HUD at the federal level. There's not an appropriate reason for local land use rules to be saying, well, we're going to allow manufactured housing here, but not there. And if folks want to opt into rules that have, you know, that tighten that, they're fine to do that, but I don't think that's the appropriate role of local land use planning. I have one of my old pieces one of my earliest pieces blogging was on trailer parks. And trailer parks are actually really fascinating because in many cases they're exempt from a lot of the standard subdivision rules that apply. So what you actually see in trailer parks is you actually generally see much narrower streets, and they effectively function as shared streets. You see much smaller lots, and then you see shared amenities. So they're really kind of fascinating as like a sort of site planning alternative, like this little sandbox where we allow like weird things to happen and how we design neighborhoods. Is there a place for income-restricted housing in the future of low-no zoning? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are always going to be people who aren't served by housing markets, even in a context where we don't have a bunch of arbitrary rules that make it hard to build. And you're just going to have to put up public money to purchase existing affordable housing and then build more of it. Yeah. What I think, I would say that the way we do this today is very topsy-turvy, where we say like, we're not going to allow any housing to be built, and then the housing that we will allow to be built, we just want to have a paltry number of income-restricted units. To me, that's a pretty unserious way to solve the problem. There are tens of thousands of local planning jurisdictions in the U.S. What opportunities are there to regionalize local planning authority? Yeah, I mean, so I think this is like an important form of dysfunction for the way we do local land use planning. Is as I was saying, every local government gets to completely do its zoning on its own, and there's a mismatch here, right? So like housing and labor markets operate at the metropolitan level, but then like every little neighborhood gets to come up with its own rules around land use planning. We don't actually do that with transportation planning, right? We have MPOs actually do transportation planning because we recognize that, hey, commuter sheds are at the regional level, and the way we plan that should be reflected in that. Yeah, I think there's an important role for more regional planning and land use planning, for sure. We've done part of that with the way we do the housing fair share mechanism in California, where we sort of allocate to the COGS, the Council of Governments, a certain amount of housing that needs to be built in that region just based on demographic and economic indicators, and then we let them assign that among jurisdictions. But yeah, housing markets and labor markets are metropolitan, and that should be reflected in the way we do land use planning. I'm starting to feel the thinness of the mountain air. Construction defect laws, oh God, yes. We've heard about that from the condo builders. Yeah. I don't want to wade into that one, sorry. It's complicated, yes. The balance is probably off in many jurisdictions, many states. Backlash from the left. I find it's either way. I mean, I think that there's a small but sort of weird fringe sort of population of left NIMBYs, but California YIMBY is so overwhelmingly a progressive organization. It's not to say that I think part of what's so great about YIMBY is that it actually has broad, bipartisan, cross-ideological appeal. You can find YIMBY progressives and conservatives, and you can find YIMBY or NIMBY progressives and conservatives. I don't think it falls neatly along battle lines. You just have to use different language, right? So if you're talking to a progressive audience, I think you emphasize, and you're not being misleading. You're just emphasizing things like racial equity and segregation and the history of zoning, or environmental sustainability, which I haven't really talked about too much tonight. Conservatives want to hear more about maybe affordable housing for families or for property rights, right? So it just depends on the content. I'm not going to roll into Berkeley and start talking about property rights, but I'm also not going to roll into Eastern Tennessee and start talking about climate change. Capped parking permits. Wow, this one's really in the weeds. This is good. The shoot needs to ask this question. This is one of those examples of planning that I don't think we do very well, that I actually think is more important, is on-street parking management. Right? We basically just have a tragedy of the common situations with on-street parking, and what that gets you is a lot of cruising, which causes a lot of traffic. So I would say having actual permits that maybe even folks can sell or trade for on-street parking is a better way to manage that. And then that's great too, because that actually collects public revenue that can be reinvested for things like, fixing up sidewalks, repaving streets, planting street trees. Always price parking. I'm upset when I get free parking, and you should be too. The car industry doesn't care about minimum parking requirements. I think in terms of an industry that's a little bit of a nuisance on this, we find that even when we remove minimum parking requirements, in some cases developers will say like, oh, my banker won't underwrite a project unless you have like 4 parking spaces per apartment. And that's like, there's no actual data there, but the car industry doesn't care. They've already done enough damage.
Before you hop into the next one, I'm going to say one more question here, and then we'll
Okay.
wrap it. Yeah.
Yeah, one more question. Oh, now I gotta really. I think cul-de-sac is cool. I think being positive in terms of messaging is really important. I think there's a reason why Yes in My Backyard has been so potent. I'm gonna do a couple small ones if that's okay.
Yeah, get after it.
Yes, you can liberalize or abolish zoning, but if you don't do transportation planning better, you're not gonna get a lot of benefits. Neuter the Colorado Municipal League. Win a couple battles, and elected officials don't get voted out of office, and then they start to realize, oh, I don't actually need to like be super paranoid about local control. Okay, sorry, one more for real this time.
We have time. I just thought you needed to breathe. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, like I'll do the most voted one. I'll yield to democracy reluctantly. Yeah, I mean, I think in California and Oregon, right, like we're all operating with political constraints, right? And like they're, you know, it's hard to undo 50 years or 100 years of bad policy. In many cases, folks are very bought into the status quo. But to my mind, I only see reform picking up speed, right? I mean, I think part of what happened in California, as I was saying with the municipal league, was a few of these reforms were passed, like statewide ADUs, that folks said like, oh, if you do this, your constituents are going to be out with pitchforks and torches because you allowed them to build a cottage in their backyard, and you're going to get voted out of office. And what ended up happening was precisely the opposite. The folks who led on reforms like that, or the folks who led on SB 50 and SB 827, can I get anybody, SB 827, rest in peace. Right, like not only were these people not voted out of office, but they were seen by their constituents and folks in the state as a whole as being leaders on an issue that like they felt in their pocketbook that was very near and dear to them. So you know, we're seeing progress on this issue, and I think you know this is you know why I wanted to write the book when I did, is I think this is an area where there's a huge amount of reform possibility, and I think we're only scratching the surface. So yeah, by way of closing, I'll say keep pushing. Like this is, I think, one of the issues of our moment, and there's a lot of appetite for reform, and you got to find some elected officials who are going to be leaders, but they're out there, and pass some bills. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Nolan. Was going to ask for a round of applause, but you're way ahead of me. Thank you for sharing all your time. Thank you for not taking a breath in the last 30 minutes. We got a lot out of you in a little time. Yeah, appreciate that. Want to make 2 quick pitches as we conclude tonight. First off, one about YIMBY Denver here. I mentioned earlier as we were kicking off that YIMBY Denver is an all-volunteer organization, and it is. But we are looking to change that, mostly so I can see my baby more often. No, actually, no. But we are trying to raise enough funds for a full-time director to accelerate and amplify this movement in Denver, the Denver Metro, and the Colorado region. We want to do more organizing of our advocacy. We want to win more elections. We want to bring more people into the fold. And we want to take our efforts to the state legislature, which I've only decided now that I heard from Nolan, of course. If you liked this event and would like to see more of it, or if you just like to see more change in our region, I'd strongly encourage you to help us out by donating through membership. If you can't offer funds at this time, sign up for a newsletter. Ask about our priorities. If you can offer time, if you can help bolster our efforts, please reach out to us. Please ask us. We're always looking for more people to help. And if you could scoot on one more, I would obviously be remiss if I did not once more pitch Nolan's book, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. I've read it more than once. It's excellent work. Learned a lot of things. We left all the juicy tidbits in there, so you know you're not going to be bored if you read it after you heard the talk tonight.
Beach read.
Yeah, beach read, classic beach read. Yeah, right when you're done with your shoot book, you know, get to this one. Yeah, so. As Nolan said, available on Amazon, available from Island Press, available from many local retailers. If you brought a copy tonight, maybe he's even going to be so kind and sign one for you, since he's a celebrity both in real life and Twitter now. Yeah, $5. All right, it's profit model here. We're taking a cut. No, thank you again, Nolan. I can't thank you enough for coming out here to join us. And if we get one more round for Nolan as we close the night. Yeah. Thank you. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a little bit more time. We have some food, we have some drinks. If you want to socialize, hang out, meet each other, talk to know a little bit more. And we decide on which bar some people that don't have babies are going to. Okay, all right. Val Brewhouse right over here. We're booted out of here at 8, so if we could please close out around 7:55, we're going to start doing some cleaning up and head out. So thank you all for joining us tonight. All right.